Rick raised his head and looked up at the sun as if he were seeing it for the first time in his life. A cool breeze wafted over him, gently touching his face. Closing his eyes, he sucked in the fresh air with his nose. Was the sun brighter than yesterday? Was it warmer? Did the air smell better? No. The only difference was that today he was experiencing it all as a free man. Looking over his shoulder, he saw that the past was behind him. The gates of his former home, where he had lived for the past 4 years, had closed and locked with a loud clang. It was a sound, like so many others, that he wished to never hear again. He had no intention of ever going back. A loud squeal brought him out of his reverie. He turned forward just in time to see a beauty that was incomparable to anything he could dream of. Across the parking lot, his wife Tracy was running toward him. "Is this for real? Please tell me I'm awake," she whimpered. Her tears wet his cheeks and neck as she sobbed. This moment, this feeling. Every night for the past 4 years, when the lights went out and his prison cell was plunged into darkness, it was this that had kept him from going insane. For the first time in a long time, he exhaled in relief and let the emotional tears escape. He was finally where he was supposed to be. That place behind him was no place for a human. This was where he belonged, here, in the arms of the only man who loved him. "Yes, baby, I'm really here, and I'm never leaving you again." If it were possible, she clung to him even tighter. She refused to let go of him, almost afraid he would evaporate and she would wake up in the morning to an empty bed. Finally, when the air threatened to close off, he said, "Baby, you have to let him go." "No, I can't." With a strangled chuckle, he said, "If you don't, I'll probably pass out." Her arms slowly unclenched. When she unclenched her legs, he let her feet touch the ground. She looked up at him and had to look away as a giggle broke out through happy tears. "Sorry about that," she said almost shyly. He shrugged. "You don't have to apologize for being overly excited to see me. There are worse ways to strangle a man to death." She let herself examine him then, looking him over appraisingly. What she saw made her mouth drop open. "I think you can do it," she joked, looking at him. Oh my God, where did this Greek god come from? She couldn't remember him looking this appetizing the last time she'd visited him, and that had only been about a month ago. The orange jumpsuit hid all that manliness. What am I going to do to him tonight? She thought. From the look on her face, Rick realized it was his turn to be embarrassed. There's not much to do. Lifting weights is kind of my thing. Yeah. She giggled, not even trying to hide what she was thinking. The moment was interrupted by a rather rough, throaty wheeze. Rick looked over Tracy's shoulder and saw her mother, his mother-in-law, standing off to the side, watching the two of them impassively. "Hi, Derek." She said it with a cold, forced good-naturedness. She pronounced both syllables of his full name as if spewing it out was physically painful to her tongue. Her face barely concealed the contempt she felt for her jailer son-in-law. She was the only person in the entire world who could make his name sound like it belonged in the history books next to Hitler and Stalin. Martha. He nodded cordially. He wasn't going to drag her into the conversation. Even her thinly veiled contempt for him couldn't ruin this day. He was free. After 4 long years in an 8x10 cell, with sadistic guards, embittered prisoners, and barely edible food, he was a free man. God, that was great. What could be better than this? Clutching Martha's hand tightly, he found the answer to that question. Peeking out from behind her legs with big, frightened eyes, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Gasping in awe, he said, "It's Anya." Martha turned to the girl, interrupting him but answering his question. "Come and say hello to your daddy." The girl looked timidly at the big man who was hugging her mom, but she didn't let go of her grandmother's hand. Moreover, she squeezed it tighter and pulled away. Martha looked at her granddaughter and said in a warm, soothing voice, Don't worry, little girl. He won't hurt you. Grandma won't let him. Anya raised her eyes to her grandmother, as if to confirm this promise. Then she slowly, cautiously, released her hand and moved closer to her father. Rick let go of his wife and squatted down, hoping to make himself less imposing. Once at his daughter's eye level, he smiled and opened his arms invitingly. The closer Anya got to him, the less intimidating he became. When she was finally in his arms, she felt them close around her. "Hello, Anya," the big man said, his deep, bassy voice filling her ears. He felt the girl's arms wrap around his neck as she said, "Hi, Daddy." That was it. The dam had been breached and the flood had come. There was no stopping it, and Rick didn't even try. The big man's eyes clouded over and tears flowed uncontrollably down his face. Tracy, covering her mouth with her hand, watched her husband and daughter embrace. Even Martha couldn't resist a touching moment. Shortly afterward, the four of them drove home. Rick sat in the back seat with his daughter. Tracy sat in the front, but was fully turned around to face the back seat and was talking to her husband. Martha drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror and rolling her eyes. "What do you want to eat tonight, baby?" "Anything you want, I'll give it to you. Anything you want. Just name it," said Tracy. The double meaning did not go unnoticed by any of the adults. How long was this car ride? 3 hours? Why was Martha only driving 60? "Mom, behave," hissed Tracy at her mother. Martha looked at her daughter and shook her head, then turned back to the road in front of her. "That's you talking like a harlot in front of your daughter." "I was asking what he wanted for dinner, Mother," defended Tracy with desperation, even though she was lying. "Get your head out of the gutter." Martha only hummed and replied, "Of course I asked." "Besides," said Tracy, looking at her angrily, "he's my husband, a husband I haven't seen in 4 years. If I'm going to talk like a harlot to anyone, who else am I going to talk to?" Martha threw her daughter a look that made her slam her mouth shut. In a voice that held a cryptic message, she said, "You really don't want to go there with me, girl. I suggest you stop while you're ahead." Tracy's eyes widened in surprise, as if she couldn't believe her mother would go there. Her face quickly turned into a grin. She looked like she was about to pounce with retaliatory words, but instead, she changed course and fell silent. What's more, she turned completely around in the front seat, crossed her arms and pouted. Something had happened, but Rick didn't know what. Tracy never gave in to arguments, especially with her mother. But he brushed it off. Whatever it would stay between them. He wasn't going to spend his first day as a free man playing the role of judge between these two. He had better things to do right now. There was a little girl sitting in the car seat next to him that he needed to get to know better. He wasn't going to miss any opportunity. He looked at his daughter sitting next to him. She was looking at him calmly, as if trying to understand him. He smiled warmly at her, hoping to soften the way she looked at him. She didn't smile back. She just looked at him with wary eyes. He saw that there was a book in her hands. The hard cover depicted a blonde girl in a white dress standing in front of an ice castle. A strange snowman and a hooded brunette stood next to her. "May I see your book?" he asked, holding out his hand. She abruptly snatched the book out of his hands as if protecting it from him. He immediately spread his hands apart in surrender. "It's her favorite book," Martha explained from the driver's seat. Rick met her gaze in the rearview mirror. "We gave it to her for Christmas last year because she loves Frozen." "What's Frozen?" asked Rick, pleasantly surprised that he could have a normal conversation with Martha. He hadn't realized she had another reason to engage him in conversation. With a smug grin, she replied, "Frozen is a children's movie that came out not too long ago. You don't know that because, well, you know." "Mom," warned Tracy. Ignoring her, Martha continued, "There are only 2 people she trusts with that book, me and her mother. We were the only ones who came after her. We are the only family she knows." And you could see in his face that he was pierced to the core. He pulled away from her eyes and turned away to look out the window. He breathed through his nostrils and his lips pressed into a thoughtful line. He watched silently as life whizzed past him as they drove. That was the story of his life. Tracy threw her mother an angry look. Martha pretended nothing was wrong. She just turned on the radio to drown out the awkward silence. She can be a real bitch sometimes, Tracy thought. A low buzzing sound came from her purse. Tracy discreetly pulled out her phone, read the message, quickly typed a reply and put it away. A slight smile played on her lips as if she was blushing. To a casual observer, this little act would have raised no questions, but to Martha it did. Tracy glanced at her mother as if trying to see if she had noticed it. She quickly averted her eyes, but a flash of something akin to guilt told a story that didn't even need words. "You've got to be kidding," thought Martha incredulously, shaking her head. The car ride to Martha's house took 3 hours, but to the 4 travelers it might have seemed like a lifetime. The 3 adults were immersed in their own thoughts, each struggling with the darkness of their thoughts. The only thing Anya could handle was the general impatience of a 5-year-old stuck in a car seat for longer than 30 minutes. A week later, Rick stared at the brick building in front of him, noticing the numbers above the front door. Checking the piece of paper in his hand to make sure he was at the right address, he tried to open the door but found it locked. He was about to knock, but then he noticed a small intercom with a button. A note was written on a piece of paper taped to the box. "Press for Officer Larry Giuliani." He pressed the button. Nothing happened, so he pressed it again. Just before he was about to press it a third time, an annoyed female voice asked, "Name?" My name is Derek Morrison." After a few seconds, the door squeaked open, letting Rick know it wasn't locked. Once inside, he found himself in a narrow, dimly lit hallway with a staircase in front of him. The stairs led to an office space. The first desk he saw belonged to an older woman whose appearance matched the voice on the intercom. She did not say hello to him. Her disinterested look as he approached suggested that the woman had been doing this job for so long that she was bored with it. She held out a clipboard with a questionnaire to him. "Have a seat over there, fill this out, and Larry will call you in." She pointed to a group of chairs lined up against the wall. The first page of the questionnaire was simple. It asked about how his home life was going, how he was feeling since his release from prison, if he had any suicidal thoughts, etc. The second page asked about his plans for finding a job, what special skills he had, and what kind of job he would like to find. Rick filled out the form just as a deep, squeaky voice came from a neighboring office. "Send him to Linda." The receptionist, aka Linda, looked at Rick. Thankfully, she didn't insult his intelligence by verbally repeating that Officer Giuliani was ready to receive him, as if he hadn't heard what she had heard. Instead, she simply nodded her head in the direction he should have gone. The office was small, and not in the fanciest sense. It was rather cramped and cluttered. There were folders of papers scattered all over the desk, laid out in no particular order. In one corner stood an artificial plant that added warmth to the room, and in the other was a black file cabinet that had seen better days. "Good morning, officer," said Rick with polite nervousness, as the rather large man sitting behind the desk looked up from his computer screen. The parole officer didn't say anything back. He just stared at Rick over the glasses that sat on the tip of his nose. He seemed to be sizing Rick up, passing judgment on the spot. Rick stood there, not knowing what to do. Should he take one of the seats in front of the table, stand until he was invited to sit down, extend his hand to shake? Curtsy? Being on the other side of a high barbed wire fence for 4 years is a long time. Life inside the prison follows different rules than it does in the outside world. Behind the wall, every interaction could cost you your life. There was a hierarchy among the prisoners that had to be respected, but you couldn't afford to be intimidated either. There was a fine line between showing respect and becoming someone's bitch. If you didn't show respect to someone with influence, the wrong people might try to send you to the medical center. But if you tried to kiss ass, That was the quickest way to end up on the team as a cheap whore. Even in dealing with the guards, there were hidden rules. Obeying their demands too easily could lead to other inmates classifying you as a snitch. Bad move. At the same time, open disobedience could get you a visit from several guards in the middle of the night. There have been many inmates who had an unfortunate fall down the stairs and ended up needing a few days at the doctor's office. After what seemed like an awkward eternity, Officer Giuliani simply said, "Sit down," and then began going through the numerous manila folders that littered his desk. Once he found the right one, he pushed his glasses up over his face and familiarized himself with its contents. "You seem to be a very lucky man, Mr. Morrison. A very lucky man. You were convicted of possession with intent to sell. The judge gave you 6 years, but you only served 4. You were one of 468 people who received clemency from a governor trying to shrug off the notion that he was profiting from the prison system. He signed pardons for inmates who committed nonviolent crimes and showed exemplary behavior." "Yes, sir," replied Rick, not realizing what he was supposed to say. "They also say you were part of the Manchester Childs Gang, or Manny. Is that true?" "Supposedly," said Rick, very carefully watching what he was agreeing to. "Manny was never convicted of having a gang." Officer Giuliani lifted his head from the file and looked at him skeptically. "That's right. He wasn't convicted because you refused to make a deal and give the DA what he wanted. He wanted Mr. Childs, not you. You were a guppy who could have only gotten 18 months if you had just played ball and given him base with a big mouth. Instead, you left your wife and kid to do time." Rick didn't take the bait. Looking Officer Giuliani straight in the eye, he replied, "With all due respect, sir, that's insulting. I've done my time for my mistakes. I'm nobody's bitch, especially Manny's. The choices I made were mine and mine alone. Now I just want to put my past behind me and move into the future with my wife and daughter." Officer Giuliani hummed and shook his head, leaning back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. He folded his hands, interlacing his thick fingers, and rested them on his round belly. Some part of his soul admired the way Rick dealt with his past. It was a good sign. Having worked for so long, the officer had a good sense of which parolees would go free and which would go back. Still, he couldn't understand that people in urban areas were so loyal to the criminal element that was responsible for the death and degradation of the neighborhoods in which they lived. No one wanted to be the one to help law enforcement eliminate him. On one hand, they protest with pickets, chanting, but right after that, they start reciting rap lyrics glorifying drug use. And then they'll treat police officers like they're the bad guys. Imagine how much better these neighborhoods would be if the good people in them banded together and really tried to stop crime in them. How many young people would be saved if the drug and gang lifestyle was universally condemned as the plague it is, rather than glorified? But that was a conversation for another day. The current conversation was going in circles if it continued, so he switched to another topic. "Let's leave it at that, Mr. Morrison. Tell me, how was your week?" The change of pace was welcome, and Rick answered eagerly. "It's been wonderful, sir. Like you said, I'm a happy man. Being at home with my wife and daughter feels like a dream." Officer Giuliani nodded, then asked, "How are your living arrangements? I understand you and your family are staying with your mother-in-law." "Ah." He rummaged through the papers until he found a name, and continued. "Miss Martha James. Is this a peace agreement? Do you get along with her?" Rick hesitated with the answer. He didn't want to raise doubts about his parole. One of the conditions of his parole was that he had stable housing. "We're on good terms," he finally said. Rick's pause told the parole officer a lot, as did his non-committal answer. He nodded again. "Okay, fair enough. You wouldn't be the first ex-offender to stay in someone's house who doesn't quite want them there. You want it to be smooth? Don't bring trouble to her doorstep. Be inconspicuous when it matters, but present when it's necessary. Wash dishes, help cook, take out the trash, but most importantly, get a job. People who do that always have peace at home while on parole. Noted, sir. Officer Giuliani was beginning to like Rick. Switching topics again, he opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small cup with a lid from there. He set it at the end of the desk, right in front of Rick. For the first 6 months, you will submit to a urine test at every visit. After that, I will perform surprise tests at my discretion. I will also make scheduled and unscheduled visits to your residence to check on you. Yes, sir, said Rick, taking the cup. Good. Now for the main point. There are a few things that will get your ass sent back to prison. Failing the test is one of them. Another is if I catch you hanging out with your old crew. Manny's bad news, kid. Stay away from him. Rick had to struggle to keep a poker face. Manny was one of his best friends. He was the only one who had been there for him when his father died. All the time he'd been locked up, there was still money in his books because Manny had been a faithful contributor. Staying away from Manny was like staying away from my brother. Nevertheless, Rick nodded and said again, Yes, sir. No illegal activity of any kind. If you keep your nose clean and get a job, you'll have a good future ahead of you. Understood? Seeing the nonverbal confirmation from Rick, he pointed to the cup and said, Now you look like a man who needs to take a leak. Officer Giuliani used an over-the-counter test. When the results came back negative, he talked to Rick about finding a job. There were programs to help ex-convicts find work. The jobs weren't fancy and paid only minimum wage, but it was better than nothing. When the visit came to an end, the parole officer escorted Rick outside. It seemed like a nice gesture, but really he was trying to take a smoke break. Nevertheless, he handed Rick his business card. This is my number. Office hours are 8 to 5. He flipped the card over, and on the back was a handwritten phone number. Looking Rick straight in the eye, he said, And this is my cell phone. I don't give this number to every parolee. I only give it to people who I think will try to stay clean. You seem like a good kid. If you get into any situation that you need help from or need someone to talk to, use this number. If I don't answer, leave a message. Rick took the card, studying the handwritten number. It was the first gesture that showed Officer Giuliani cared. Thank you, sir. Pulling a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, he pulled one out. Before bringing it up to his mouth to light it, he said, And if you ever want to do the right thing about Manchester Childs, call me for that too. I know the detective who's on his case. I can promise you he'll be glad to hear from you. He'll probably get you anything you want. Wit Pro, a nice cozy place for you and your family. Who knows? I'll keep that in mind, he said, even though they both knew he was lying. With those words, Rick headed towards the bus stop, leaving Officer Giuliani to finish his cigarette. Next chapter. After his meeting with the parole officer, Rick felt encouraged. On the bus ride to his mother-in-law's house, he read papers about programs that would help him get a job. By bringing in money, legal money, he could change Martha's opinion of him. For some reason, he cared what she thought of him. He knew she'd never really liked him. She didn't hide it either. Before he went to prison, he didn't care what she thought of him. Tracy loved him, and that was all that mattered. But it was different now. The world was different. He was completely different. Plus, he had a little girl to think about. When he was in prison, he shared a cell with a man who had become like an older brother to him. Craig was an older man who was serving a life sentence. He had been in prison since he was 25 years old. He had 3 children, one of whom visited him. The other 2 wanted nothing to do with him. Craig talked a lot about regret. He had plenty of it. Every day he woke up with it, showered with it, and ate with it. It was his omnipresent partner. One day, Craig said something that Rick remembered. He said that sons grow up to be their fathers, and daughters grow up to marry their fathers. If dad beat mom, chances are the cycle will repeat itself in the next generation. The sins of the father haunt the children long after he is dead and gone. That's what life is all about, what a person leaves behind. Forget about money, jewelry, and women. Great men accomplish great things, but legends leave behind a legacy. When the coffin is lowered into the ground, only memories remain. What kind of husband did he want for Anya? Did he want her to marry a drug dealer addicted to easy money? To a man who couldn't hold down a steady job or provide for his family? Hell no. Rick was determined to win Martha's respect. In his eyes, she was his mirror. Tracy would love him no matter what he did. Even if he was wrong, she would be with him to the end. But Martha had no ties to him, no loyalty. If he earned her respect, he would in turn become a man worthy of his daughter's respect. He was going to show her that he had become a different man, even if it meant he would have to stay away from his brother. As he walked from the bus stop to his mother-in-law's house, he noticed a sleek, glossy black BMW 8 Series convertible parked on the curb in front of his mother's house. Even the wheel rims matched the color of the paintwork. 4 wheels easily fit $100,000. When he opened the front door of his house, who did he find sitting on his mother-in-law's couch? Leaning back on the cushion, resting his ankle on his knee, and his arms stretched across the back of the couch sat Manny. Without knowing any better, one would have assumed he lived here. In this picture, even Anya was playing, sitting comfortably in the middle of the floor, as if there was no strange man sitting 5 feet away from her. There he is, the man, the myth, the legend, said Manny, grinning broadly. Said Manny, spreading into a wide grin. Said Manny, spreading into a wide grin. And by golly, you've gotten big. Tracy said you've tightened up, but I didn't expect this. You look like you're full of juice. Rick heard his probation officer's voice. The advice he had been given as recently as an hour ago echoed loudly in his ears. He wanted to do the right thing for himself and his family, but he couldn't just bluntly tell Manny to leave and never come back. And could he anyway? What's wrong, Manny? Said Rick doubtfully. And Manny didn't seem to notice the hesitation in his friend's eyes. He stood up, walked over to Rick, and hugged him tightly. The smell of his expensive cologne hit Rick's nose. His expensive sneakers, designer clothes, and $100 haircut said that he was doing well. Tracy came out of the kitchen. She walked over to Rick. Hey, kid, she said hoarsely as she finally exhaled. How was your first meeting with your parole officer? It was great. He gave me a bunch of paperwork on how to get a job, made me take a urine test, talked about staying out of trouble. Then, addressing the elephant in a half-joking manner, he looked at Manny and added, He told me to stay away from you. Manny chuckled. Really? He said that? How does he even know me? Shrugging, Rick said, He's a cop, and you. Touch CC. Manny's eyes moved to Tracy. It was a quick flash, but something passed over them, something that made all of Rick's hair stand on end. First, there was the way Manny was looking at her. He looked back at her and smirked slightly. Knowing Manny as he did, Rick recognized that look. He had seen the way Manny looked at many women more than once. A familiar smile flashed in his eyes, as if he knew something about her. Maybe it was the memory of seeing her naked, or the knowledge of how strange she was that made him lick his lips as his eyes roamed over her. All Rick knew was that this gaze was usually accompanied by some weird story about what he and the woman were doing. The two of them would laugh about it for hours. But there was nothing funny about it now. Tracy quickly broke eye contact, released herself from Rick's embrace, and walked back into the kitchen. Perhaps it had to do with his insecurity over his long separation from his wife, or perhaps it was his ability to read people. Whatever the case, Rick was very attentive to things that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. He caught a certain vibe that hit him hard. He didn't want to think about it. He couldn't understand it. But there it was, right in front of his face. It was undeniable. Manny was entertaining his wife. Rick rubbed Manny's shoulder, drawing his attention away from his wife. Giving him a hard look, he nodded his head toward the front door and said, Let's take a walk. The two of them stepped outside and walked down the street. As they did so, Manny's voice came to them now and then. Listen, Rick, I came by to thank you in person. You could have fed me, but you didn't. You made it real and kept your mouth shut. I respect that. Rick shied away from the conversation. He wanted to wait until they were out of sight of the house. When they had gotten a considerable distance away, Rick stopped walking. Manny realized that Rick was no longer walking beside him and stopped as well. Turning around, he saw Rick frowning and looking at him. Is that the only reason you came? Asked Rick finally, with reproach in his voice. What? Rick closed the open space between them, throwing his friend a threatening look. I came home and found you sitting on my couch, my wife in the kitchen, and my daughter playing on the floor. My mother-in-law is at work right now, and you are alone with her. Is there something you want to tell me? Manny just laughed like Rick was being funny. Bro, you're seriously tripping right now. No denial. No questioning what the hell Rick was talking about. Interesting. Really? Asked Rick, taking another menacing step forward until he and Manny were within a few centimeters of each other. I've known you a long time, Manny. I want you to stand here, look me in the eye, and tell me you weren't having fun with Tracy. The smile slowly left Manny's face. The calm and collected gleam in his eyes was gone. All that was left was a flash of something. Dangerous. You've been away for a long time, Rick. I realize that. But things have changed during your absence. The only reason I haven't pulled this out yet. Rick looked at Manny's hand, which was slowly lifting his shirt to reveal the butt of a gun sticking out from behind the waistband of his jeans. Because you're like a brother to me. So I'm going to give it to you for free. Other people who have made a move on me, like you just did, didn't get that little speech. Now I suggest you take a couple steps back and lower your voice. As angry as he was, Rick's logical brain kicked in. Yes, he and Manny were friends. That's how he knew what Manny was capable of. Would he be able to get to Manny before he finished him off? Maybe. But even if he successfully took the gun away from him and kicked the ass he should have kicked, the altercation would probably get him sent back to prison. He couldn't take that risk. So he reluctantly took a step back. But he didn't back down. Still looking him in the eye, he slowly repeated his question. Did you entertain her? To his credit, Manny let out a sigh, as if regretting what had happened. However, instead of answering, he said, Look, bro, that's a question for her. Ironically, that non-answer was an answer in itself. Nevertheless, Rick needed to hear those words. Continuing, he said, But I'm asking you, bro, like man to man. You owe me that. Sighing once more, Manny finally gave in. Look, if it wasn't me, it was someone else. Remember, you weren't supposed to be gone for 6 years. Tracy won't last that long. You should have known that. The fact that she lasted as long as she did is a testament to that. So that's why you were entertaining my wife? She was going to entertain someone, so it might as well be you? Rick said through clenched teeth with furious tears, threatening to spill over. Of all people, you were the one who had to protect her. What the hell did I do? Shouted Manny, his emotions taking over as well. Do you know how many diapers I bought for Anya? How many times I gave Tracy money for groceries? Who do you think bought your daughter all those toys she was just playing with? See those brand new clothes she's wearing? Guess who bought them? Me. That's who. Me. Rick's eyes were practically boiling now. His fists were clenched so hard that his nails were digging into his palms. If Manny wasn't on his hands right now, Rick would be on top of him, raining down punches. Still retaining some modicum of sanity, Rick didn't give in to the temptation to pounce on him. Instead, he asked, So you want to replace me? Is that it? You want my family? Asked Rick. No, Rick, said Manny, as if Rick was talking nonsense. You and I both know that in Tracy's eyes, no one can replace you. I just wanted to help your family like I helped you. I made sure you all were well taken care of. I put money on your books so you could always afford to buy what you needed. And I made sure Tracy had some pocket money so she could take care of Anya without having to beg Mom too often. I tried to be there for you as much as I could. And that gave you the right to entertain her? Was that payment for your generous hospitality? Manny shook his head, sucked his teeth, and groaned, as if Rick just didn't understand him. Look, maybe she and I got a little too carried away, but it wasn't like that. One day when she came to get money for Anya, I saw her crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said how much she missed you. Then she just burst into tears. I mean, man, her eyes were bulging. I tried to calm her down, but she sure as hell wouldn't stop crying. Manny must have been completely convinced of his innocence, because he was talking to Rick like he was telling a funny story, like he was talking about how he was entertaining some other guy's wife. Manny continued. I made her a drink, and she started talking about how she wanted you. He shrugged as if that explained everything. After that, things went from there. By now, he had noticed Rick reacting to his story. Trying to backtrack a little, Manny quickly added, but it's over now. As soon as she found out you were paroled, she called the whole thing off. I backed off out of respect for you, no questions asked. Wait, what? If this was supposed to appease Rick's rage, it came out quite the opposite. More than that, it infuriated him to the point of physical sickness. A queasy feeling settled in his stomach as a new realization hit him. Maybe it was his ego protecting itself, but he had unconsciously built up a scenario that somehow made this situation more manageable. A drunken night out, a lapse in judgment. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Not only that, but it happened until they found out he was one of the 400 lucky ones. That's what the inmates nicknamed them. But that was only, what? 6 friggin' months ago? Manny may well have been entertaining his wife for years. What was he supposed to do with this information? Thank Manny for being such a good guy and bringing his tormented wife back to him? Rick's hands began to tremble. His breathing became labored. Every muscle in his body tensed. A red tint appeared in his eyes. Anya. She needs her father. She needs him to stay out of jail and not come back. That was exactly what Rick kept repeating to himself in his head. It was the only thing holding back the demon inside him. But the cage was rattling violently. The lock wasn't strong enough to contain the snarling beast. Manny saw a chain reaction, a losing battle for control. Emotions flashed across Rick's face like a movie screen. Clenched jaw, flared nostrils. Manny knew that look. He'd seen it many times in the past. Rick was standing on the ledge, about to jump off. But Manny knew Rick as well as Rick knew him. As befitted Rick, he was confused. This had always been his dilemma. He was a wolf who had convinced himself he was a German shepherd. He was always trying to do the right thing, always trying to be something he wasn't. Even when they were running around together, doing the most illegal things known to man, Rick drew invisible lines in front of him that he wasn't supposed to cross. Blah, blah, blah. However, it was all just a facade. The lies he told himself were firmly rooted in him, giving him hope that he was worthy of love. Want to get to know the real Rick? Rick was the man who'd put a man in the hospital for 2 weeks because he'd hinted he was going to approach Tracy if he didn't get the goods at the price he wanted. Even if he didn't hurt anyone, he left a strong enough impression that people didn't want to meet him in their lives. The downside of Rick was this insufferable martyr complex. Instead of keeping all the unpleasant minutiae of his life a secret, he felt the need to tell Tracy everything. He wanted to be frank with her about who he was, to show her the man she had married. Honesty is needed in marriage, was his mantra. He would sacrifice himself on the altar of her and her mother's disapproval, and then whine to Manny about how bad he felt about continuing to disappoint them. In Manny's opinion, the real reason Rick felt guilty was because he did not feel guilty. So he convinced himself that deep down, he was really a good guy who just happened to do bad things. And while it annoyed the hell out of him, it was why Rick was a great right-hand man. He had enough sharpness to see things through, but also enough guilt to not aim for the top spot. His loyalty was just built into him. But now, for the first time in his life, Manny wasn't sure what kind of Rick he'd see. Having fun with his wife made a man a little unpredictable. Instinctively, Manny's hand slid down and grabbed for the gun on his belt. Man, he really didn't want to shoot his former friend in the face. To keep them both out of an unpleasant situation, Manny took a couple steps back and calmly said, "Look, I'm going to get out of here before you do something we'll both regret. For that matter, I'm sorry you feel like I stabbed you in the back. Someday, hopefully, you'll realize that I really did you a favor. But that day isn't today, and that's great. But—" Manny's gaze became hard and threatening, and he gripped the hilt tighter. He spoke in a tone that left no room for interpretation. "Don't let emotion override logic. If you don't do anything stupid, like stalking me, you'll be fine. Got it?" Rick didn't take his eyes off the ground. He was afraid that if he looked at Manny, the last crumbs of willpower would dissipate. In a voice shaking with barely contained rage, Rick said softly, "Get out of my sight, Manny. Go away and never come back here again. Stay away from Tracy and Anya." Finally, raising his eyes to his friend turned nemesis, he finished, "If you come back, I'll kill you. And you'll need more than this desert eagle to stop me." Manny just nodded and stepped back. All the while, his hand remained on his hip, and his eyes never took his eyes off Rick. Once he was at a safe enough distance, he turned and walked to his car, leaving Rick standing alone. Tears of rage covered Rick's eyes as he heard Manny's expensive engine start with a quiet whirring. His emotional pain seemed so intense that it turned physical. His head was splitting. His stomach was cramping. His arms ached. Wait a minute. His hands hurt? Looking down, he saw the prints of his fingernails digging into the skin of his palm. The area around it was red and inflamed. Footsteps sounded from behind him. Turning around, he saw Tracy walking towards him. She stopped when she saw the look on his face. Tears were streaming down his face, fists clenched. He knew. Damn, Manny. He had promised not to say anything. He had promised. "Rick, baby," she began, but immediately faltered. What could she say? And even if she could find the words, would he listen? The only thing that kept Rick from grabbing Tracy by the throat was the sight of his daughter standing in the doorway, staring outside. Even through the rage, so intense that he was shaking, her beautiful face shone through. If he lost her now, he would lose Anya forever. He couldn't become the monster who had attacked her mother. He couldn't. So Rick did the only thing he could do. He turned and started to walk away. When he heard her footsteps, he started jogging. Her voice screamed his name, begging him to come back to her. This only made him switch to running. He felt like a coward. He had never run away from anything. Since childhood, he had always been taught to stand his ground, to fight until he could fight no more. Running away was for weaklings. But he ran away from his cheating wife. And the guy who was cheating on her was just allowed to walk away. Yeah, he was a wuss. But he'd rather be that than lose the chance to have his daughter's love. So he ran, far and fast. He ran until his wife's piercing screams were gone from his ears. Part 2. Night had fallen, and there was still no word from Rick. Tracy sat on the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. She absent-mindedly watched Anya playing on the floor. Her thoughts raced at warp speed, racing through various levels of guilt, fear, worry, anxiety, and stress. Next to her on the couch lay a cell phone that refused to ring. For the millionth time, she checked it to make sure there were no missed calls from unrecognizable numbers. Not a single one. The only person who answered her frantic text was Manny. Yes, she knew she shouldn't text him, especially after today, but she had no choice. She had to find out exactly what Manny had told Rick and how much he knew about the two of them. What happened to not telling Rick? Manny. He already knew. He asked me about it. He didn't say a damn thing. You must have tipped him off. Don't blame me because you can't control your man. That's on you. How much time does he have left? Enough. He said he'd kill me. I've had enough drama. Dump my number and find yourself a man before I have to do something about it. Damn! Damn! Damn, thought Tracy, glancing at the time. It had been almost 4 hours since Rick had run off. Tracy went from concerned to extremely worried and frantic. Rick could take care of himself. She knew that. But still, he had been gone for a very long time. A lot had changed in the 4 years since he'd left. He didn't even have a cell phone to call her if there was a problem. Plus, he wasn't in his right mind when he ran away. Rick had a temper and often got into trouble because of it. In her imagination, he could punch the first person who looked at him the wrong way or confront a cop who wondered what he was doing in the wrong part of town. If his parole was jeopardized because of her, she'd never forgive herself. Please, 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 Lord, let him be okay! Movement was heard on the front porch of the house. She glanced at the front door and was alert. When the doorknob jingled, her heart beat faster. Unfortunately, when the door opened, it was her mother, not her husband, who entered the room. Disappointed and depressed, she sank into a chair. Martha absent-mindedly flipped through the mail she'd pulled out of the mailbox on her way into the house. Bills, 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 always bills. She sighed. "Hi, Trace," she said when she saw her daughter on the couch. Her voice was exhausted as she dragged herself inside. Everything about her spoke of how hard her day had been. Upon seeing her grandmother, Anya jumped up from her seat and ran up to her, letting out a joyful squeal and an excited, "Grandma!" She wrapped her tiny arms around one of Martha's legs. Despite her fatigue, Martha still perked up at the sight of her granddaughter. Tossing a pile of papers on the coffee table, she bent low to properly greet Anya. "Hello, pretty girl," said Martha in an excited baby voice. "How's Grandma's favorite little girl?" "I'm hungry," Anya replied with a wide, toothy smile. Her forehead furrowed in annoyance and confusion. "Your mom didn't make you anything to eat?" She looked at Tracy and was about to start ranting. But for the first time she noticed something was wrong with her daughter. "Trace?" she asked with concern in her voice, lowering Anya to the floor. And then it hit her. She looked around suspiciously and asked, "Where's Derek?" Tracy's face began to crumble. With trembling lips and a shaky voice, she replied, "I don't know." At that moment, the dam burst. Sobs erupted from her that shook her shoulders and chest. Martha thought angrily, "That damn asshole! Not even a week later, and he's already walking around and getting into trouble. I knew I shouldn't have let him in my house." Aloud, she exhaled in frustration. As much as she wanted to talk to Tracy about her delinquent husband, she needed to feed her granddaughter first. So she went into the kitchen, put on an apron, and opened the refrigerator to see what she could whip up. She would deal with Derek later. Next chapter. Rick took a deep breath. His elbows rested against the bridge railing, and he leaned over, watching the traffic below him. The sounds of speeding cars, trucks, and big diesel engines mingled with the wind. Ever since he was a child, this place had mesmerized him. The noise and bustle of the traffic was kind of hypnotizing. No matter what was going on in his world, this place reminded him that he was just a small speck in a sea of billions. There's always someone somewhere who has it much worse. In each of the cars below, there were such people. Each of them had their own unique story. How many of them had cheating wives? Had cheating wives? Sold drugs? Where were these men going? Where did they come from? What happened to get them in that car at that exact time? It was mind-boggling. As strange as it sounded, it made him feel less alone. After talking to his ex-girlfriend, his thoughts whirled through his head. Anger and rage gave his legs a false energy as he ran away from Tracy. Adrenaline kept him running even when it felt like his lungs were about to explode. He felt like he had to keep moving, like he could physically outrun the murderous desire that burned in his belly. Eventually, he had to stop. Anger could only take you so far. His life was proof of that. Sooner or later, a person has to stop and look around to see where their anger has led them. Usually, the place you find yourself turns out to be the very place where karma has been patiently waiting for you. Luckily for Rick, he ended up here. Perhaps his subconscious had led him here, a place of tranquility from his childhood. His thoughts had been wandering ever since. Surprisingly, his thoughts weren't about Tracy, at least not directly. He was thinking about life. He thought about his mother, who had been taken from him in a random act of gang violence. She had died when he was only 10 years old. There was one song she used to sing to him when he was scared. It always made him feel better. But he had long since forgotten that song. He could barely remember her face. That had bothered him once. He felt that by forgetting her, he was betraying her memory. After his mother's death, his father had become a drunken wastrel. He was filled with rage. The police knew him by name because he spent so much time in the months that followed trying to find the people responsible for the pain he woke up with every day. The more the police let him down, the more he got drunk. After years of broken promises and feelings of hopelessness, he just gave up. He finally followed his wife to the grave on the 5th anniversary of her death. The official police report said he got behind the wheel drunk and fell asleep at the wheel, but Rick believed his father chose that night himself. His father always got behind the wheel drunk. He couldn't do it any other way since he had never been sober. Until this night, he had never gotten in trouble behind the wheel. Maybe it was just an accident that caught up with him, but the timing of this coincidence said otherwise. Accident or not, the result was the same. Rick was all alone in this world and had to fend for himself. So he did what any teenager would do when abandoned by his family. He found another family. At the time, he and Manchester were young street thugs. Street thugs are one and the same. They are pawns in any chess game. The war on drugs really meant a war on small-time crooks. No one wanted to take on the big game unless there was a huge reward. It was too much work, too many man-hours, and it only led to a sudden power vacuum that needed to be filled. Still, there were a few things that encouraged police officers to do their jobs. Re-election time for officials who wanted to make a name for themselves, notoriety in the community when the reputation of the police service suffered, and an FBI investigation that threatened to take over and take credit. All of this forced the cops out of the donut shops and into the streets to catch a large perch. Eventually, Manchester went from pawn to knight. He did things for his king that most people would find unthinkable. Eventually, as any street king should, an untimely death overtook him. War erupted into an urban Game of Thrones. Gangs and factions vied for their share of the crown. The Sanchez family, better known as the Colombians, were eager to take part in this game to see who would be their new distributor. They were the ones who were the invisible ghosts behind the scenes. They didn't care who came out the winner. They just planned to make the winner a very rich man, just like the previous one. Rick and Manny had to go through a lot of potential kings. The wrestling itself changed them fundamentally, made them do monstrous things. But while Rick only did what he had to do to survive the bloodbath, Manny grew to love the monster he had turned into. It made him powerful. He was feared. His name became synonymous with boogeyman on the streets. If he was spoken of in less respectful terms, it meant a visit from him or Rick. And a visit from them meant a bad day for all involved. Now he was a big base. He was the king. It was re-election time for the mayor. You know what that means. He needed a big win. A big win required a big name. The loudest name, without going after the Sanchez family, was Manchester Childs. After all, that was King's true purpose. He was the face. The one who took full responsibility so that the ghosts could remain free to haunt another dynasty. Long live the king. The district attorney and the chief of police were tasked with catching Manny, and they went after him as hard as they could. Unfortunately, people were divided into two camps. There were those who feared Manny and Rick more than the police, and those who didn't know enough to be helpful. So they changed tactics. Instead of going after the king, they should have just taken his knight. If they could turn him over, everything else would fall apart. Only one problem. Manny's night couldn't be flipped. And believe me, they used every possible scare tactic on Rick. When that didn't work, they went after his biggest weakness, his family. By then, Rick had saved up quite a bit of money. He had always been good at cutting hair, so he kept a local barber shop. Naturally, it was a front to launder Manny's dirty money. At least a third of his fortune passed through it. Still, it was a legitimate business. He had other barbers working for him, a steady clientele. He even cut his own hair from time to time. Rick was successful. He was able to buy his wife the house in the suburbs he'd always dreamed of. She had a new car and a closet full of clothes. The two of them were even thinking about private school for Anya when she came of age. Life was good. Until the DEA officers kicked in his door at 2 in the morning. That was their plan. They were going to rip that good life right out from under his nose. They were going to take all his possessions and sell them to the highest bidder. His house, his cars, everything. Unless he gave them to Manchester. Rick didn't flinch. He didn't give up. He took his chances in court. His house was seized, his barbershop closed and boarded up, his cars sold. It ended with him going to jail to wait out the trial and his wife and newborn baby going to live with her mother. It was a long struggle. His family went through hell. What little respect his mother-in-law had for him was fading fast until it turned to dust beneath her feet. But Tracy had remained loyal. At least he thought so. Most other women would have thrown themselves into finding the next rich man to set up their lives, but Tracy didn't. She moved in with her mother, surviving her disappointment. She took a job at the local Walmart to the whispers of people talking behind her back. The DA fought hard but overreached and lost big. He wanted to link Rick to Manny's empire, murder, extortion, you name it. But the evidence only came back with possession with intent to sell and a weapons charge. Worse, he couldn't even get a weapons charge. If he had, he would have gotten Rick at least 10 years. Perhaps then he would have had more leverage. But the 6 he could squeeze out weren't enough to make him turn his back on his best friend. Even when the going got tough, Tracy was still there for him. That's what was so hard to come to terms with. How could she be so loyal, yet so disloyal at the same time? How could the same lips that kissed him when he was finally free become the same lips that kissed Manny? Or worse. The friends with benefits type relationship may have been the beginning of Trick, Tracy and Rick, but their incredible bond began to spill over into the realm of the heart. Despite Rick's busyness, he proved to be surprisingly reliable and straightforward. He didn't insult her intelligence with paper lies about where he got his money from. It was refreshing to Tracy, although there's something to be said for the world when a drug dealer becomes the symbol of honesty by which all other men are measured. Winning her trust was a direct route to winning her heart, and he'd done both in record time. He only had to look at Tracy to realize why he was with her. Makeup, no makeup, dress and heels, jeans and sneakers, none of it mattered. Any room Tracy entered belonged to her. Even now, people joke about her work. When did Walmart start hiring Instagram models? And yet he was caught up in what was in her chest. Her heart was soft and vulnerable. It made him want to protect it from anyone who might break such a delicate pearl. She cried during movies no matter what was going on. A sad scene with slow, dragging music, tears. A happy scene with upbeat, triumphant music, tears. A cute baby or adorable puppies, a long uh-oh, followed by tears. She was always happy to see Rick. A smile spread across her face, showing all her white teeth. As they walked, she would grab his hand and pull him to her. When they sat down next to each other, she would either lean against him or stretch her legs out on his lap. And when she looked at him, her eyes danced. The two of them could chat for hours, not realizing that they had never done anything all day. That was why he hadn't hesitated to propose to her when she handed him the positive pregnancy test. Her voice shook almost as much as her hands. When he kissed her forehead and said, "I have you," she knew everything was going to be okay. Honestly, he hadn't been surprised she was pregnant. But now, looking back with the gift of 2020th's foresight, he was forced to reevaluate his relationship with his wife. He honestly couldn't remember, but that didn't stop his mind from working on his insecurities. It became his enemy, bombarding him with visions of Tracy and Manny. Had they gone on dates, watched movies together, spent nights out, played with Anya? How badly had he been switched? All he wanted was to change his life, to make things right in this world. But people like him don't often get a second chance. The mistakes of the past haunt the man, shrouding him in the stench of failure. All he could do was keep showering. One could only hope that eventually he would be able to live a clean life. All around, night had fallen. The air was chilly. Since he didn't have a cell phone and pay phones were on the verge of extinction, he had no choice but to walk home. Next chapter. While Anya was in the kitchen happily eating macaroni and cheese with chicken and vegetables, Martha dragged Tracy by the hand to the back bedroom. "What's Derek doing in there? Is he bringing drugs into my house?" "I won't put up with this crap, Tracy. I've worked too hard to have this ex-con ruining my life." "What, Mom? No," exclaimed Tracy, completely shocked. "He's not like that anymore. Why do you always think the worst of him?" She snorted caustically and replied, "Because he's a criminal. And I expect criminals to commit crimes. I have common sense." Waving her mother off, Tracy said, "Never mind. I'm not going to get into this with you. I have too many worries right now. He's not bringing anything into your house or committing any crimes. Get over it already." Placing her hands on her hips and tapping her foot on the floor, she asked, "If it's not Derek, then what's going on here? Why are you sitting here crying?" Reluctantly, Tracy told her everything. She told her about how Manny had shown up a few hours ago to check on her after not seeing her for 6 months. He was also hoping to see Rick and welcome him home. She knew that her mother would not approve of Manny's presence in her house, so she was hesitant to tell her about it. She wasn't going to let him in the house, but he had promised that he would be the perfect gentleman. And for the most part, he was. The situation didn't get awkward until Rick walked in. Tension was building. Even though nothing had happened between her and Manny and hadn't in a long time, the tone was completely off. It was as if he just knew. As the two of them walked out the door, Tracy realized with a sinking feeling that this encounter was not going to end well. Nothing good she couldn't imagine. Why did she have to let him in? And why was she even having fun with him in the first place? Despite her predictions, it didn't end the way she had envisioned. There wasn't even a fight. Instead, Rick just ran away. It was probably the best outcome she could pray for, but it still left an empty pit where her stomach had been. He'd just run away, but from her. Tracy always had a calming effect on Rick. Her smile was the only thing that could diffuse a tense situation. But this time, the situation was bad. With her gone, there was nothing that could keep Rick from bursting into anger. And yet somehow he'd managed to keep his composure so that he wouldn't lash out at Manny even under the influence of justified anger. How was that possible? What else but her could have had such an effect on him? Was it a sign that he was really changing, or a sign that he no longer needed her like he used to? Martha listened with interest, though her discontent with her daughter had reached stratospheric proportions. How could this possibly go wrong? "Please tell me I didn't raise you to be so stupid, Tracy," said Martha despairingly. Yes, her daughter was hurting, but she couldn't muster up enough sympathy to worry when there might be a murder in her house. "What the hell is wrong with you? What makes you think inviting him here was a good idea in the first place? One drug dealer living in my house isn't enough for you, so you go and find another one you have fun with and invite him over?" "Mom." "Shut up. I've been more than favorable to you and the criminal who married you despite my feelings for him." Rising to her feet, Tracy sank her gaze into her mother's face. "You won't call him a criminal anymore. He has served his time and paid his debt to society. His name is Rick, and that's the only way you're going to address him." Martha exhaled noisily through her nostrils, looking at her daughter. Some part of her soul wanted to respond to the audacity of this little girl who had the courage to defy her. Another part of her respected her. Martha might have noted that Rick had already served time, but 4 years was an extremely lenient sentence for the monster they'd portrayed him as during the trial. Even if they couldn't pin everything on him, there was no way Rick could have bought that house and those cars with the money he'd earned from a crime that only carried a 4-year sentence. And yet she'd given in. There was no way to make her daughter see Derek in any other light than that of the man she loved. Despite all his faults, Martha was sure of one thing. He loved her daughter too. Did he love her enough not to put his wife and daughter through another such ordeal? Martha hoped so, but she didn't expect it. Only time would tell. Holding out a small olive branch, she said, "When Derek shows me differently, I'll look at him differently." Tracy smiled at her mom in appreciation. "Give him a chance. He will." Martha hesitated, but she had to push those doubts aside because something else was bothering her right now. "So let's talk about the fact that you had an affair with the biggest drug dealer in our neighborhood and that you let him into my house. You keep talking about your love for your husband, but this seems awfully suspicious." Tracy looked at the floor and sank back onto the bed. "Manny and I are over. It's been over for a long time now. You don't have to keep throwing that in my face." Martha looked at her daughter with narrowed eyes, snorted, and asked, "Who were you texting with the day we went to pick up Rick?" "Huh?" "In the car when we were driving back. I caught you texting someone on your phone. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Who was it?" Tracy stammered for a second, stopped and made a guilty look before admitting, "Okay, it was Manny." When Martha threw up her hands in despair, Tracy quickly added, "But it wasn't like that. He just asked if we'd taken Rick." "Then why were you giggling like a lovesick girl?" "What? I wasn't giggling because of Manny." Martha just stared at her with an unconvinced expression. After thinking for a moment, Tracy nodded as if she remembered something. "Probably because he was asking if Rick had Hooters. I think I sent him an emoji with hearts in his eyes or something. I don't know. That was about a week ago. But you have to believe me. There's nothing between us." Shaking her head, Martha said, "How many times are you going to say that, Trace? Saying it a bunch of times isn't going to change anything. What difference does it make that you didn't have fun with him tonight? You had fun with him as a married woman who loves her husband so much. You can't play semantics when you invite chaos into my house. You are a grown woman, and I have tried to stay out of your affairs. But you have a daughter of your own to take care of. She should be the most important thing to you, not running after these assholes." Feeling the need to defend herself and her husband, Tracy said, "I don't chase men. I wasn't chasing Manny, but I'm chasing Rick because he's not a man. He's my husband." Martha snorted irritably through her nose. "Then you should have thought of that before you had fun with someone else." Her mom was right. She hadn't thought about it. To make matters worse, she was constantly being hit on. Guys at work, guys on the streets, even the babysitter's boyfriend tested her chastity. She was always on edge, snapping at the slightest thing. Yes, she loved Rick with all her heart, but Mom needed a release. Maybe that was the problem. Tracy had never had to chase men. She always had a choice. She wasn't chasing Rick, and she certainly wasn't chasing Manny. Both men were at her disposal. She chose Rick because he was prettier and seemed more good-natured. When the judge lowered his gavel, he sentenced them both to 6 years without each other. They were separated by 3 hours and an impenetrable prison. Their only relief was a 10-second hug twice a month. Dutifully dropping her eyes to the floor, she said, "You're right, Mom. I started all of this, and now I wish I could take it all back." For the first time today, Martha looked at her daughter and felt sympathy. She walked over to her, cradled Tracy's head against her chest, and hugged her as she had as a child. Their attention was caught by the front door opening. Tracy lifted her head, and both women looked at each other. Tracy then rose to her feet and walked around her mother. Both women reached the living room at the same time. Both saw Rick standing with his eyes downcast to the floor and his hands shoved in his pockets. "Rick, baby!" said Tracy with relief in her voice, rushing over to him. He recoiled from her and stepped back as if he was afraid to touch her. Addressing Martha directly, he said, "Miss James, I want to thank you for putting me up in your home. I know you don't much approve of me, but you did it anyway. For that I am grateful. But I can't stay in your house any longer. I cannot allow Anya to grow up remembering me as an evil man who mistreated her mother. But that is what I shall become if I stay." Martha, amazed at his demeanor and openness, simply asked, "Where will you stay?" Rick shrugged with a sad expression on his face. "Honestly, I don't know. I don't even know how this will affect my parole. But I'm willing to take the risk if it means I don't become something I don't want to be. I just want what's best for Anya, even if it means I won't be around." And then Martha saw him. The image of the man Tracy was talking about flashed in her eyes. He was trying to change, to be a better man. It wasn't an act. He wasn't doing it to look better, or to win some points. He was doing it for one reason and one reason only. Anya. He truly loved his family enough that he wouldn't put them through such an ordeal again. Maybe I was wrong about him, Martha thought. For the first time, she didn't see him as a drug dealer. She saw a man who desperately wanted to be someone else. He just needed help to make it happen. Clearing her throat, Martha said, "I don't think that's a good idea, Derek. Like you said, you don't know how this will affect your parole. If you're really trying to change, as you and my daughter keep telling me, being a martyr and going back to prison is not the way to prove it. You owe it to Anya and to society at large to fully reform yourself." Rick nodded, but the pensive expression on his face didn't disappear. He lowered his eyes, afraid to look at Tracy. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice quiet and vulnerable. He sounded like a lost boy trying to find his way home. The police officers couldn't break him. The courtroom couldn't break him. Even prison couldn't. But that's what he stood before them now, broken. Tracy felt like rushing over there and hugging him. He needed her. It was at times like this that he leaned on her. But she couldn't be there for him, not now. At the worst possible moment, she couldn't comfort him because she was the reason he was there. Walking over to him, Martha lifted his chin so that he was looking at her. Capturing his attention, she said, "You're going to sleep on the couch, and tomorrow you're going to see your parole officer. Explain to him that you and Tracy are having problems and need another place to stay. I know there's temporary housing for people just out of prison, but you're not going to violate your parole. You're going to do the right thing, because the best thing for Anya is a father who will do right by her. You're all she has, so your only reason for being on this earth is to be the man she needs. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he muttered humbly. "Rick." Martha looked back and threw her daughter a disapproving glance to silence her. Then she turned to her son-in-law again and asked, "Are you hungry? There's macaroni and cheese, chicken, and mixed vegetables in the kitchen." Rick nodded and, still avoiding looking at Tracy, went to the kitchen to get something to eat. Tracy followed him, but Martha grabbed her arm to stop her. "Mom, let go. I have to talk to him." "No," she said, pointing a finger in her face. "Not today. You two will talk, but not until after he's settled somewhere else." Tracy's face contorted. "What? Are you serious?" "Screw it. He's not going anywhere. He's my husband, and he's going to stay here and work things out with me. I need to talk to him. Tell him I love him." At that moment, Martha did something she had never done before. She slapped Tracy right in the face. Hard. Tracy looked at her mother with big, hurt eyes, holding her injured cheek. Her mouth was open in surprise. But there was no apology on Martha's face. Instead, she asked sternly, "Do you know what he just did? What he was willing to do? He chose her." She pointed to Anya, who was sitting at the table playing with the food on her plate. "That's exactly what he's doing now. He's choosing her over himself. What do you think he really wants to do to you in Manchester right now? Do you think he wants to stand here with his head down, like he's afraid of his own voice? Of course not. You're not denying him the opportunity to be a father. But, but nothing. Leave him alone. For the first time, I understand. I see what you see. I see that he's trying to be a better man. But right now, he needs you to give him his freedom, because right now, you're the only thing preventing that. So let him go. When he's ready to talk, he'll find you. Do you understand? Tracy's heart wanted to keep fighting, but she knew her mother was right. So she reluctantly nodded her head in agreement and hugged her mother. Martha stroked Tracy's head, pulling her close to her. Turning her head toward the kitchen, she saw Rick sitting at the table with Anya. He bent low and kissed her on the head and then started eating. I told you he was different, Tracy said jokingly, as if she'd read her mother's mind. Martha snorted. Shut up, Tracy. No one likes gloating. Next chapter. Officer Giuliani leaned back in his chair, studying Rick as he had yesterday. Part of his soul wanted to laugh out loud at the absurdity of the situation. Only yesterday he'd warned Rick about keeping a low profile to keep Miss James happy. Only yesterday he had warned him about staying away from Manchester Childs. Only yesterday. But today? Life can be funny. Still, at least he was here, volunteering his story. This conversation could have come from a jail cell because he had done something stupid. It would have forced the officer's hand and would have frustrated him greatly. You did the right thing coming to me, Derek. Thank you for staying out of trouble. And of course, it helps that Miss James came with you to confirm your story. With that, he nodded to Martha, who was sitting next to Rick in front of his desk. She returned his gesture. Her presence here was another point of interest. Yesterday, he had gotten the impression that Rick and this woman were not on the best of terms. And yet here she was, sitting next to him and trying to find options on how to help him. Unless he was mistaken, it looked like the woman was genuinely concerned about his future. Either something had changed between them since yesterday, or Rick was wrong about this woman not loving him. Either way, it only said good things about the young guy. Yes, I can get you into housing. Unfortunately, it will take some time. There is a bit of a waiting list. If it had been arranged from the beginning, things would have been different. But I understand, said Rick, though a concerned expression appeared on his face. Officer Giuliani sighed. Is there any way to coexist with Mrs. Morrison for the time being without doing something stupid? Rick looked at Martha beside him, and then at the floor. His face answered that question for him. He sympathized with the guy. Really, he sympathized. This was just bad luck of the worst kind. Unfortunately, there were no good solutions today, only ones that were less lame than others. Leaning forward, he said, Look, kid, the best thing you can do right now is to keep busy. Stay out of the house as much as possible. That would be possible if you had a job. So why don't you start there? Get busy looking for a job as if your sanity depends on it. Find something that will suck the energy out of you. In the meantime, I'll put you on a waiting list. When I find something, I'll call you. Okay? Rick nodded. He stood up, held out his hand, and said, Thank you, Officer Giuliani. He took Rick's hand and shook it. Then he walked them both out and waved as they got into Martha's car. Good luck, kid, he muttered as he put a cigarette in his mouth and lit it. Rarely had any of these parolees gotten under his skin in such a short time. After so many years on the job and so many disappointments, he was used to ignoring them. It helped him keep a detached demeanor, keeping his head out of the liquor bottle. But sometimes, he just couldn't help himself. After all, he was only human. Next chapter. In the weeks that followed, Martha's house was strangely quiet. Not to say it was peaceful. In fact, there was hostility in the air, even though no one was fighting. The silence of avoidance was worse than the noise of shouting or yelling. At least with noise, problems were solved, rather than left for later. This cold indifference was haunted by an evil spirit. It hovered everywhere when they were in the same room. Even when they weren't in the same room, Tracy felt the icy shiver of its quiet anger. And so life in Martha's house began to feel like that slow moment in a thriller before the main death. Every slightest sound intensified against the stillness of eerie nothingness. The tension builds because you know that at any moment something bad could happen. And that knowledge keeps you in suspense, in a state of uncertainty, in anticipation of a jump scare at a crescendo. Tracy decided to take her mother's advice and give Rick his freedom. It was killing her emotionally, undermining her sanity every day. She was left to wonder what was going on in his head, which in itself was torture by 1,000 cuts. By not calling the monster by name, its mystery made it even more powerful. Every morning she had to wake up alone in her bed. When her husband slept in the next room, it was much worse than when he was in jail. She had to endure him walking past her as if she didn't exist. His eyes looked through her, never catching her pleading gaze. But the most amazing thing was that his relationship with everyone had improved dramatically. She saw him interacting with Anya with such joy that it both warmed and broke her heart at the same time. Even her mother, who had once hated the very air he breathed, smiled when she talked to him. Tracy often caught the two of them together in the evenings at the kitchen table as they filled out job applications and put together resumes. Pretty soon she became a ghost. She could only observe the world around her through an invisible barrier, but she was forbidden to participate. Still, she followed the advice. It was right for Rick, right for Anya, and right for the peace of the house. Who cared if it was wrong for her? No one. Her heart was breaking every day, and it was her fault. And now, it's all gone. Her life was a damn mess. It wasn't going the way she'd dreamed it would for the last 4 years. And this? It was a twisted nightmare, a twisted wish fulfilled by an evil genie. It was as if she'd gotten everything she'd wished for, only to be left behind. She wanted to bask in the happiness that Rick was finally home and part of her family. She wanted to laugh when he made Anya laugh, to cry on his shoulder after a sad movie. Instead, her husband ignored her, slept on the couch, and made plans to leave without her. It was unbearable. Every day she walked to work with the unfortunate cloud hanging over her head. Every night when she went to bed, she flooded her pillow with tears. Still, he heeded his mother's advice, no matter how much it pained her. Days of silence turned into agonizing weeks. Rick kept busy, vigilantly looking for work. He faithfully went on early dates and thought only of his goals. And about other things. But he knew he couldn't go on like this. Pretending Tracy didn't exist required more energy than he could maintain. At night, he would stand outside her door and listen to her cry herself to sleep. In the morning, he'd walk past her, pretending not to notice her puffy eyes. Part of his soul wanted to forgive her. He knew she was sorry. He wished he could just leave it at that and forget the whole sordid, despicable story. And honestly, he probably would have succeeded. If she'd slept with anyone but bloody Manchester Childs. Rick wasn't the only one who noticed the effect the silent treatment had on Tracy. Martha looked at her daughter with concerned eyes as she dragged herself around the house each morning to take Anya to the babysitter and head off to work. Each evening passed in solemn silence as everyone danced around the elephant in the room. To smooth out the awkwardness and fill the air with sound, they all just played with Anya so they wouldn't talk about it. One evening, a little over a month later, Martha found her son-in-law on the back porch looking up at the sky. He had a notebook in his hands, in which he occasionally wrote something. "Mind if I sit down?" she asked, approaching him from behind. Slightly startled, he jerked his head back but then relaxed. "Not at all, Miss James. You can sit wherever you want. This is your home." She sat down next to him and said, "I was hoping that by now you'd start to consider it your home too." Rick shrugged and looked off into the distance. With a sad expression on his face, he said, "With all due respect, it's hard to think of him that way with all this going on." She nodded understandingly. There were many things about her son-in-law that she liked. Chief among them was his complete honesty. Rick looked at Martha strangely, as if a question was burning on the tip of his tongue. Finally, he asked, "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" "Hmm? I guess not. No offense if I choose not to answer it." He pondered the question for a few seconds, and then simply asked curiously, "Has there ever been a Mr. James? In all the time I've known Tracy, neither of you have ever mentioned her father." Martha took a deep breath, and a hunted expression appeared on her face. She seriously considered exercising her right not to answer. Finally, she said, "Let's just say Tracy's father was a very bad man." "Did he hurt you?" Martha averted her gaze before nodding. For some reason, this made Rick angry. He felt a strange need to protect this woman, even from the ghosts of her past. Her eyes glistened in the dim moonlight, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away with her thumb, not wanting to shed any more tears for this man. She was done with him. "I was 18 years old when I gave birth to Tracy." Before it could reach consciousness, Martha raised her eyes to the same stars Rick had just been looking at. Speaking with some nostalgia, she continued, "I thought he was so nice. He drove a nice car, wore nice clothes. Women were always eager to be with him. For some reason, he singled me out. He wanted me even though older, prettier, and faster women were trying to get his attention." She grinned bitterly and shook her head as if she couldn't believe her stupidity. "It made me feel so special. He bought me things, took me on dates, showed me off to all his friends, and told me I was the number one woman to him. The number one lady." Her voice became more animated as the telling of her own story stirred up old feelings. Come to think of it, she never told her story to anyone. She kept it inside her, hiding it from the rest of the world and from Tracy. But the feelings of anger and resentment hadn't gone anywhere. They just shifted to someone else, who turned out to be another wolf in sheep's clothing. I allowed him to neglect me in a way that disgusts me to even think about it. I did things for him that no woman should ever do for a man. But when I took a pregnancy test and saw that I was going to be a mother, I knew I had to leave him. I couldn't let Tracy grow up with that monster. I had to choose between the man I loved and my unborn child. And I chose her. I understand. Rick nodded. And there was silence between them for a moment before Martha spoke. "Now it's my turn. I want to ask you something." "Shoot." "What are your plans for my daughter?" Rick moved awkwardly but then jokingly asked, "Didn't you already ask me that question when I started dating her?" She couldn't help but giggle. And if memory serves me correctly, I didn't like that answer very much either. But seriously. Rick sighed and shrugged slightly. "Honestly, I don't know." "Do you still love her?" A groan escaped through his nose, but he nodded. "Listen," she said, leaning forward. "My daughter doesn't always make the best decisions in the world, and I know this Manchester thing is a mess. But I know she loves you, and this silent concern of yours is killing her. I'm not telling you to take her back or even forgive her, but you can't keep punishing her like this. You have to talk to her, let her know how you feel. Ignoring her is cruelty, and it will start to hurt Anya." Righteous indignation slammed into him from the inside, forcing him to cut in. "Miss James, no offense, but I can't do anything to her even close to what she did to me." "I'm sorry." He looked at her apologetically. She nodded and he continued. "She slept with Manny the whole time I was locked up. All the time. And to make matters worse, I don't think it was a mistake on her part. It wasn't something they just fell into. I think she did it. To him. Because she wanted to do it. With him. I know for a fact that he always wanted to sleep with her." Martha nodded understandingly, but objected cautiously. "I don't think she came to him with the intention of having an affair, at least not the first time. If memory serves me correctly, she said she and Manchester got drunk. Rick looked at her as if he didn't believe her. Miss James, I know your daughter. I know how she flirts, how she acts. She went to Manny's house to get money to buy something for Anya, but she got there wearing a short skirt and net stockings. Why would she need to dress like that if she wasn't going to be there for more than 5 minutes? Martha hated the logic that what a girl was wearing was an indication of her motivation. To her, it was a form of slut shaming, an excuse that absolved men of responsibility for bad behavior. If she wore those clothes, she obviously wanted one thing, right? But Rick wasn't done yet. What's more, she started crying about how much she missed me and how she needed to feel me inside her. That's what she told him. Does it feel like friendly conversation when you show up at a guy's house at night in a short skirt? Or does it feel like an invitation? He'd obviously been thinking about this for quite some time, probably a month. The dots had been connected, and he had come to some logical conclusions. Even Martha had to breathe a sigh of relief. So you think she planned to do this all along? Rick shrugged again. I don't know about all that, but I know damn well she left the house that night with the intention of having fun. And you think she did it because she doesn't love you? Shaking his head, he replied, Love had nothing to do with it, Miss James. I think she just didn't plan for me to ever find out. Well, that's for sure, she thought to herself. Out loud, however, she said, Let's switch places, Derek. Let's say she's the one doing 6 years and you're the one forced to take care of Anna. You're a good-looking guy. You're bound to get a few women. Grinning, Rick said, Why, Miss Robinson? I think you're trying to... Shut up. They both burst into laughter. It was nice to see him do it. But Martha wasn't done yet. She wanted to make her point. If you had to be separated from her for 6 years, wouldn't you be tempted to find some temporary toy? If this question had been asked of someone else, it would have been meaningless. The theoretical nature of the question meant that there could be no wrong answer. Rick might as well have answered with a smug, hell no, and there would have been no way to refute it. But Rick didn't answer right away. He thought for a moment before saying, I honestly don't know. I'd like to think I don't, but I've never been in that position. I've never cheated on Tracy, but she's always been just one car ride away from me. Before Martha could savor her victory, Rick added, But I can't base my resentment on what could possibly happen in an alternate universe. Maybe. In this universe, your daughter betrayed me, and very badly at that. Does she still love me? Yes. Do I still love her? Unfortunately, yes. But none of that changes the fact that every time I look at her, I see him. I see him making the same faces he makes with other women. I see her moaning the same way she does with me. Worse, I see the fact that they've spent so much time together that Anya feels more comfortable having him around than I do. I see it all, and I can't turn the damn picture off. This time, he didn't apologize for the slipped swear word. Martha didn't even see fit to force it on him. She just gently placed her hand on his knee and said, Then don't turn it off. Talk to her about it. Tell her how you feel about her. Tell her how much you are hurting because of her selfish actions. Stop trying to deal with it alone and stop being afraid of your own voice. Just because you are mad at her doesn't make you the bad guy. If you tell her she's talking crap, you're not losing your daughter. She brought that pile of crap to your front door. You're going to give it back to her so you both can clean it up. Rick didn't say anything back, just frowned and turned away. Martha read the new temperature of this conversation and saw that Rick had frozen. Still, at least he was thinking about it. She could see the wheels turning up there. Not wanting to overstay her welcome, she got up without saying a word and patted him lightly on the shoulder, heading back into the house. Tracy watched her mother walk away. She was sitting on the couch in the living room. Martha smiled encouragingly at her and disappeared out the door. Moments later, Rick walked in. Tracy looked at him expectantly and hopefully. When their eyes met for a moment, her heart jumped. Please tell me something, baby. Please. But he didn't. Instead, he averted his eyes and walked sadly to the bathroom. At that moment, guilt began to give way to anger. Every time he ignored her or didn't pay attention to her, that anger grew and mutated. Now it began to shift into its new state, resentment. He can sit on the porch, laughing and joking with my mother, who hated him not so long ago. And he has nothing for me? It's been a month and still nothing? She returned her attention back to her phone, to the addictive game of online poker she was now winning. If he wanted to be like this, fine. Screw him. A tear came to her eye, but she suppressed it. Why should she cry for him anymore if he was done with her? Because she loved the shit out of him. That's why. Despite her best efforts, the tear broke free from the prison she had imprisoned it in. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.